history, humankind has had to endure the violent, often destructive forces of nature. But Noah had the right idea. He prepared. Today, we are much better able to predict disasters. But are we as well? The death toll and devastation caused by recent disasters suggests that our geological world is undergoing some catastrophic changes. The natural disasters are on the increase. The 1999 spate of earthquakes in Turkey, Greece and Taiwan added fuel to that fire. In fact, if we look at the number of major earthquakes throughout the 20th century, 1999 comes out about average. But that is no consolation to the many thousands killed and maimed as a result of these disastrous events, or to those left homeless, their livelihoods gone. The sad fact is that although the number of natural disasters remains fairly constant, the number of people affected has risen dramatically. In this program, we will explore the consequences of these catastrophes. And more importantly, look at what can and should be done before the disaster strikes. Throughout 1999, catastrophic events such as these accounted for thousands of lives and economic losses amounting to billions of US dollars. It is estimated that 96% of these deaths occurred in developing countries. Hardly surprising when close to 1 billion of the world's population are living in makeshift shanty towns. Dealing with the consequences of these disasters takes up vital resources. Resources that could be better used to help these countries grow. But if the pattern of natural disasters has remained relatively unchanged over the years, why is it that so many more people are suffering from these catastrophes today?
Statistically, I expect more deaths from earthquakes, and it is possible to have one earthquake that will kill as many as 1 million people, simply because these targets now exist. They didn't exist 50 years ago when there weren't cities with populations exceeding 8 million. But now the populations have gone up in 27 targets around the world, super cities, parked at plate boundaries.
As populations increase and cities expand in regions prone to earthquake, hurricane and flood, so the death toll as a result of these events will undoubtedly rise. And the devastation of a major industrialized city could severely affect the world economy. For less affluent countries, the effects can be disastrous. 2 major earthquakes in just over 3 months have left Turkey with enormous social and economic problems.
If you leave aside the tragedy of loss of human life, which is in the first loss is estimated something in the region of 17,000, 18,000 people dead. The economic losses are expected to be in the region of 6 to 7 billion US dollars, which means 3 to 4% of the GNP being lost in these catastrophes, which is, I think, disastrous.
If you've got a rich economy that is able to absorb this quite easily, then there's very little collateral damage in the economic situation. But as it would be in an individual's case, if the loss is such that your economic well-being is crippled, then the consequences are obviously enormous.
The victims of natural disaster have to live with the consequences for years to come. A cyclone and floods in Orissa, India, and devastating mudslides in Venezuela killed thousands and left millions of people much more vulnerable to the annual seasonal storms. Many richer nations also felt the violent forces of nature. Torrential rains in southwest France caused death, injury, and untold damage to vineyards and villages, creating havoc with the local economy. We may have to live with the threat of natural disasters, but we don't have to accept the catastrophic consequences.
Les régions qui sont susceptibles d'avoir de telles inondations sont de mieux en mieux connues, de mieux en mieux référencées. Ce qui fait qu'il y a des plans particuliers d'évacuation des populations en cas d'événements exceptionnels attendus. Mais c'est toujours en train d'être amélioré au niveau des temps de réponse et de l'évacuation des populations.
Being aware and prepared for the onslaught of these often predictable events can help alleviate the suffering, reduce the casualties, and ease the socio-economic burden imposed upon those most at risk. In Bangladesh, tens of thousands of lives have been saved by the Cyclone Preparedness Program. During the severe cyclone and devastating floods of 1970, around 500,000 lives were lost. In 1994, a cyclone of similar intensity left just 127 people dead.
The good thing about this program is not only a Red Crescent initiative, but this includes the local communities into this program. Local communities get involved into the planning, into implementation, into building the basic capacity at that level. Now, to achieve that goal, it needs very high level of integration, coordination, and networking between different programs and different agencies.
Bangladesh is a prime example of just how effective disaster preparedness can be. But building to withstand flood, fire, or earthquake is not a new idea. So what lessons can we learn from the catastrophic events of recent years?
Buildings do not need to collapse during earthquakes. The engineering is quite well understood. Usually the cost of these things is perhaps only 10% more than the original cost of the building. And perhaps for 20% more we can build a building that will not fall down in any kind of likely earthquake that the building will experience in its lifetime.
İyi bir yere kaydırılması gerekiyor. Çünkü bu 67'de oldu, daha önce oldu. Yani belirli 25-30 sene aralıklarla oluyor. Yani her zaman 30 yılda bir bunu yaşamaktansa şehrin daha güzel bir bölgeye kaydırılıp burasını artık iş alanı mı yaparlar, ne yaparlar onu bilemeyiz, onu bir araştırmak lazım. Yalnız konut olayı daha sağlam bir bölgede yapılabilir, buraya yakın.
One of the most important lessons learned in the 1990s was that to ensure sustainable development, nations must create more effective disaster preparedness plans that again ensure that life and livelihood are protected.
Knowing what needs to be done is one thing. Being able to afford it is another. Many disaster-prone countries rely on the often overwhelming response and generosity of aid agencies and the international community to help them through a major catastrophe. If just half of those same funds were used for prevention rather than response, the human suffering and economic losses would be greatly reduced.
There is very high level of awareness and interest from donors when it comes to disaster preparedness. But maybe this awareness is not matched by the same funding levels.
I think there is need to advocate what can be saved through preparedness programs more. In this respect, media can play a very significant role. There isn't enough coverage of good disaster preparedness, disaster mitigation programs. Media still tends to go after emergency events, relief, a high number of deaths and losses.
The insurance industry can play a significant part in disaster preparedness. We've got quite sophisticated modelling techniques now which allow us to have good level of confidence in the prediction of the level of damage. If you can buy insurance, that is a good indication that the level of risk is acceptable. If you can't buy insurance, then you should ask yourself whether you should be staying in that area or that building.
But the question remains, if we have the knowledge and resources, why isn't more being done to help prevent the tragic consequences of natural disaster?
For the governments, there are so many other pressing priorities, particularly governments of poor countries where disasters have a major impact. They have to balance it against health needs or educational needs, which are very important. As far as the public is concerned, it's sometimes lack of awareness and lack of knowledge of the risk.
It may be an old adage, but it still rings true. prevention is better than cure. Not only can it save lives, it can also ensure the economic and social stability of a community, a country, and in some cases a whole region. Increasingly, aid agencies and response organizations throughout the world see disaster preparedness as an essential part of their work.
Disaster preparedness is a global responsibility, and as such, we would encourage policymakers and decision makers to understand that risk reduction of natural disasters is both practical, feasible, and it makes common sense. And those elements should be incorporated into policies, practices, and their investment strategies.
The efforts being put into disaster preparedness are beginning to reap rewards. The challenge is to maintain the momentum, to ensure that wherever disaster strikes, those most at risk are prepared and protected from yet another tragedy.